Welcome to Books of Our Time, brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Thank you for joining us as we continue our discussion of Bernie Madoff's $65 billion Ponzi scheme with financial journalist Erin Arvedlund. Erin has written for Barron's, the Wall Street Journal, the Moscow Times, the New York Times, TheStreet.com, and Portfolio.com. She is with me to again discuss her book, Too Good to Be True, The Rise and Fall of Bernie Madoff. And I am Arthur Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Thank you for sitting for a second hour, Erin. We may even do a third hour, we'll see. I think this program's going to be the Bible on Madoff. I really do, because the news media in general, the print media, has done such a bad job. But, and so did, and other television shows gave it short shrift. But okay, be that as it may. We were on the red flags, and we had discussed the one-man accounting firm, and we had discussed the lack of sufficient options. Mm-hmm. Why don't you explain the custodial situation, which was not unique to Madoff, but was somewhat unusual?
Sure. So most of us have mutual funds as our investments, and in the fine print on your statements, or which you can usually check online as well, most of the big mutual funds in this country do not actually have custody of your money. They don't actually control the money. All they do is buy and sell on your behalf. Right. It's complicated, and basically what that means is there's usually an independent third party that's the custodian of your assets. So if your portfolio manager actually is touching your money, that's not a good thing.
Right.
Normally the way it works is if you have a financial advisor, so for instance, let's say I'm an independent financial advisor and you're my client. Your assets are in custody with, say, Charles Schwab or Vanguard or Fidelity or American Funds, and I just direct what we buy and sell on your behalf. Bernie Madoff didn't do that. Madoff was like some other hedge funds, and we can talk a little bit about the differences between hedge funds and mutual funds anyway, but he kept custody of all his customers' money. So if I wrote a check to Bernie Madoff, it went into a bank account which he controlled. That is a very unusual arrangement. There are some other hedge funds on Wall Street that still do it, but it is increasingly discouraged. In fact, the custodial arrangement, having a third party between your money manager and your money, I think could one day become the law of the land. Right. Because it's the reason why there are so few frauds in mutual funds.
Right.
It's very hard to steal the money. So having an independent custodian hopefully will prevent this kind of thing in the future. However, it is still possible to do that. It's not illegal, and it's a question that investors should always ask of themselves. Or you can call your 1-800 number and say, who's the custodian of my assets? Right. It's your right as an investor.
Right. This is a sort of a digression, but as background.
Yeah.
Back in the 60s, and all times before that, when you bought stocks, like we had, suppose I call you and I say, Erin, buy me 1,000 shares of IBM. I should only be able to afford that. You would call somebody down on the floor. That person would,
yep.
The stocks would actually come into your office. They would be taken around Wall Street. There were runners running all over Wall Street with securities, so that you actually manufactured the physical pieces of paper, which you would then send to me. This caused such fantastic, what we call back office problems, that they started doing all this electronically so that the securities don't run around Wall Street. They're all in the possession, I guess, of the Depository Trust Corporation.
Well, the results of the trades, yes, are in the DTC. Correct.
Yeah, which one of the two organizations that the SEC didn't bother to call.
Correct. Yep. On Madoff's behalf, right.
So that this custodian stuff is not quite what it once was, but still you always want somebody between, well, let's put it this way. The more that responsibility gets split up, the more difficult it is for anybody to make off with the money.
To steal your money, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, so Madoff made sure he did it in a way that he could steal your money.
Yep.
Okay. Now, people talk about the consistency of his returns. He never lost money.
Yep.
Do you think that is a true red flag? And most people think it is. Do you think it is?
I think never having a single down year can be an enormous red flag that warrants further investigation.
Yeah.
Like we were talking earlier, Bill Miller had a fantastic record for years. He had a losing year.
Yeah.
And you know why? Because people lose money in the stock market.
Yeah.
I hate to break it to you, but nobody makes money 100% of the time.
Yeah.
So I think it's not a standalone red flag, but it's a place to start asking questions.
There were 4 months out of about 127 or something where, just to be cautious, he reported a loss.
Madoff reported some minor losses.
Yeah,
yes.
like 0.5% or something.
Mm-hmm.
But in no year did he report a loss. Now, it's always seemed to me, I can remember talking to my accountant and said, well, you know, I don't know how this guy does it, but somehow or other he does it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what affected people dramatically in this way were, one, he never he never pretended he was delivering big returns.
That's right.
In fact, the last thing Depository said to me when or one of the last things when I met with him, we swing for singles, not home runs. To the average bloke in the street, this makes a lot of sense if you're not greedy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so that was one thing. And the other thing was people like Bill Miller, who ran the Legg Mason Primary Trust Fund, and I think that for 12 or 15 straight years he beat the S&P. Mm-hmm. And then there's, of course, as somebody pointed out to me recently, I wasn't smart enough to think of it myself, Warren Buffett.
Sure.
So these geniuses do exist.
But they sometimes lose money too.
But see, Miller and Buffett never lost. Miller lost money starting about 2006, mm-hmm. or didn't do as well. He lost money. But he went about 12 or 15 years beating the S&P every year and not losing money. And I think Buffett has gone, who knows how many years. And his average is 23 or 27%. So you kind of figure there are these rare geniuses around.
Sure.
But yeah, does it require, okay, fair enough. So, you know, it could be something that warrants further investigation.
Right.
You were talking, when I so rudely cut you off, about the lack of visibility in the market of his alleged securities trades.
Right.
Why don't you explain that a little more?
Bernie Madoff and his brother Peter ran a very successful brokerage firm, and they were innovators on Wall Street, and everything about that business really was fairly transparent. Although the Madoffs were also famous for a practice known as payment for order flow. They pioneered this on Wall Street, and basically what it meant was they would call up their customers, their big clients, you know, like Bear Stearns or Fidelity or Charles Schwab, and say, we'll pay you a penny a share for every order you send our way. So a penny, say, didn't seem like a lot of money, but you know, when you're getting into the millions of shares a day, that's a lot of money.
You bet. You bet.
At the time, Madoff was just castigated up and down Wall Street, particularly by the New York Stock Exchange.
Right.
However, Madoff sat on a very influential committee, an SEC advisory committee, and others, and he basically convinced them that payment for order flow was a good idea. And not long afterwards, pretty much everyone on Wall Street started doing it. It's now standard practice.
Now, can I make let me interject something here, if I may. Payment for order flow has been called a bribe. And if you did it in an ordinary business, it would be called a bribe and graft, and we have rules against it in the foreign, you know, companies doing business abroad. Mm-hmm. And the reason I think that you can comment on this if you like, that the SEC adopted this was probably because it was the only way known to break the monopoly of the New York Stock Exchange, make it worth people's while to send stuff to Madoff because he's paying them these bribes. And they'll do that, and you break the monopoly of the New York Stock Exchange, and ultimately the investor pays a lot less money for execution of his trades. Now, is there any merit in that idea?
You know, payment for order flow is, there is merit to that argument, but there's merit to the counter argument, which is, you know, well, basically what Wall Street says is, well, if it's disclosed, then it shouldn't matter. But you and I and everyone else in America really may not have any idea that our broker is getting a kickback, essentially, for selling your order. My stock order. Does it make for a more liquid market? Maybe. There have been actually many academic studies looking at payment for order flow. So I actually leave it to the experts. But I guess what my point really is to show that Madoff, on the brokerage side of his business, was always pushing for faster computerized trading, for a way to win more business, whether it be, you know, legal or some say, you know, sort of not quite on the up and up. However, the practices that they innovated now have become standard.
Standard, yeah. And interestingly, putting that just to one side for a second, a lot of people said that giving up all this money to his feeder funds, the 2%, the 20%, very much like payment for order flow. You're making it worth people's while to do something.
Absolutely. I mean, Madoff was a master at greasing palms.
That's the whole story.
And it wasn't just the feeder funds. I mean, look at Jeffrey Picower. You know, there were a couple of key investors who acted almost like these big billion-dollar feeder funds, and in return they were getting extra special returns.
Right.
So Picower, for instance, allegedly one year got 900% in one of his accounts. In exchange, he kept bringing in more money.
Yeah.
Now, sadly, he's dead now. He died in the last couple of months, and so we'll never actually know, you know, what he knew.
Right.
But I guess the point was that Madoff knew that if you kept the cash coming in and you let the money raisers keep all the fees, then business was going to keep going.
Cash will keep coming in. We'll return to Picower in just a few minutes. The man was found at the bottom of his pool, the alleged victim of a heart attack. I think if you believe that, you believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And I'm not saying either one's wrong, but I certainly wouldn't say either one's right either. But okay, we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. The idea that everything was run by family members. On Wall Street, this was a real no-no. Now, as I was telling you during the intermission, as it were, to those of us who grew up in immigrant families, and the same is true of the Vietnamese today and the Koreans today, the whole family always worked in the family business. You had a little store, you had a little printing plant, you had a this or that. This was no big deal, but on Wall Street, the fact that everything was controlled by one family, that was a real red flag to people, because it makes it too easy to cheat, because your family's not going to turn you in.
Well, right. You know, it's actually a rarity on Wall Street that families work together. I mean, Sandy Weil's daughter went into the business in a separate company. Trying to think of some other examples.
He fired his son-in-law.
Right. Hank Greenberg's sons both went into the insurance business at competing firms. Hank Greenberg of AIG. But to actually work at the same company and control all the levers of, you know, the funds, the compliance, and the money, that was very unusual.
Yeah. And another one was that people thought the amount of securities that he claimed to be trading, they would affect the market, even if just a little bit. But nothing ever seemed to affect the market. Now, this is interesting in another way, which goes maybe the next time we talk. We'll get into it, but Picard, the SIPA trustee, could buy stocks over time. When people buy or sell big blocks of stocks, hundreds of millions of shares, they don't do it all at once. They space it out over time so as not to affect the market. Bernie Madoff never claimed he was spacing out over time, and yet you never could see any result. The market didn't go up, didn't go down because of Madoff.
Right.
So that was another thing which you have mentioned. And finally, the last one, which is something that most people right over their heads. He went into treasuries at the end of each quarter. Explain why that was.
On these phony statements that Madoff and his cronies on the 17th floor operation of his office building, on these statements that he created, many times it would show that investors' money went to cash at the end of the quarter and the year, or cash meaning treasuries or a riskless investment. And
It'd be a money market fund.
yeah, Madoff claimed that this is because he was timing the market. He knew when to get in and out. I just learned this myself, that many forensic accountants say that if someone goes to cash at the end of each quarter or at the end of each year, that's apparently the hallmark of a fraud.
Right.
Because it means that at the end of a quarter, when people are really looking at their statements, there's no record of where the money's been invested. So to say that something's in cash, apparently it's a hallmark of someone who's stealing.
Doesn't want you to know what he's doing.
Exactly.
Yeah. I understand, Erin. Is this true that at the end of each quarter, brokerages have to send the SEC lists of their holdings, but not if they're in cash or treasuries?
That's right.
Yeah.
It provided, being in cash provided Madoff a loophole whereby he didn't have to report anything of substance to the SEC.
Right.
And he was sophisticated enough, because he had been in the brokerage firm for so long, because he knew the loopholes, and there are many,
Yeah.
between brokers and financial advisors or money managers. There's what they call a lot of regulatory arbitrage that goes on.
Right.
He knew all the loopholes, and he knew that if he was in cash at the end of important periods, he wouldn't really have to report much.
Right. Erin, I want, at the beginning of the last show, I said there are two things that people are interested in. One was the extent to which the family was involved.
Right.
And the question of, was the family business fraud? And the other is, where'd the money go?
Right.
Now, it is said that over the course of the Ponzi scheme, something like $170 billion went in and out.
Right.
At the end, about 1 year before the end came, it is alleged he had over somewhere between $17 and $20 billion in this 703 account at Chase Morgan. And how that came to be taken out so that at the end he was left with a few million we'll get into. My question at the moment is, where do you think the money went? Do you believe that it all went to redemptions?
There are a lot of numbers tossed around
Right.
in the Madoff case.
Now, let me interject something
Yeah.
right there, because this is a perfect place. The government knows. Irving Picower, the trustee, knows.
Uh-huh.
The government and Irving Picower tell the rest of us very little as they can get away with.
Right.
And they claim it's because they're doing investigation. Meanwhile, people are sitting there. I mean, there are literally people who are going through dumpsters for food.
Mm-hmm.
And as our government always says, ever since 1941, I take it back that far. Secrecy is the order of the day in government and quasi-government, and that's what we're facing. But okay, I interrupted
No
you, and I
problem.
apologize.
I'll address the IRS and the trustee in the matter of numbers. So I tend to stick with, so Madoff's original confession was that he lost $65 billion. And let's assume, for argument's sake, that that's the right number. Now, that $65 billion included all the phony profits that he had claimed to be making for decades. I actually believe it went back almost to the very beginning, so 1960. So let's assume Madoff claims he's lost $65 billion. We take out an average return of 10% a year going back several decades. Probably the real cash lost was closer to 20 or 21 billion. It's still a staggering amount of money.
Now that's at the end, right?
That's at the end.
Because a lot of the rest of the people
2008.
took back.
So this is what the Madoff trustee is now sorting out.
Yeah.
Who took out more than they actually put in? Because those people may be subject to what's known as a clawback.
Right.
And Irving Picower, who's the lawyer charged by SIPC with sorting this mess out is apparently trying to reconstruct the records of who took what money in and out. And so there were two big winners. Let's assume that all those phony profits, right? So that adds up to about $45 billion, right? As an investor, I pay taxes on that money. So a third of that, all those phony profits went to the IRS.
Right.
So the IRS probably made, over the life of the Madoff Ponzi scheme, I would make a very non-mathematical estimate of $15 billion in taxes.
Right.
Now, how much of that money do you think the IRS is going to give back?
Right.
This is what investors are now contemplating, is not only did they lose their investment, but they paid taxes on that money.
Right.
If they were, at least if they were, not taking the money out. So the IRS was a big winner. And then, of course, now we have the question of...
Can I interject something again right there? It's entirely possible. And we don't know. And the IRS is not talking. And Picower is not talking. And the FBI is not talking. It is possible that $45 billion was fictitious profit. It's also possible it was $100 billion.
Right.
And it's possible that the taxes, now you got a lot of the money was tax-free because it went to charities. But it's also possible that something like $45 or $50 billion worth went to taxes. And the IRS says, I guess the commissioner of the IRS, I hear he's a very nice fellow. It's kind of odd, this is a digression. But he's the son of people my wife and I have known since 1958 or 9. My wife was his mother's roommate in a sorority. And the guy who was the Kotz, who's the Inspector General for the SEC, I think is the son or grandson of my wife's doctor in Washington. I've got these tentacles out that I don't even know I've got. But the IRS will give back maybe 5, 10, 15 billion. It's keeping an awful lot and saying, hey, after 3 years or 5 years or whatever rule, you can't go back to 1995 and get your money back that you paid us because the SEC messed up, so we got all this fictitious tax money.
There is a bill in Congress under consideration, or being sponsored anyway in Congress, which would allow victims of any financial fraud, not just the Madoff fraud, to get their back taxes for the life of the financial crime. It's not the law of the land yet, but it's under consideration.
Is that the Meeks bill you're talking about?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, then of course there were the favored investors, like Carl Shapiro, Jeffrey Picower, Stanley Chase, and about, I believe it's 245 special accounts who, they got more than just the 10% a year. They got extra special big fat returns, and the speculation is that they got that money because they were bringing in a lot more. So
let me ask you something about Jeffrey Picower. Now, I can understand all of that about Stanley Chase and about other people who were a part of that, like the Cohns of Comad, and like Walter Noel of the
Fairfield Greenwich, yeah.
Thank you. Fairfield funds include Fairfield Greenwich. These guys all made hundreds of millions in commissions and so forth off of Madoff. But Jeffrey Picower was, as far as has been told, and again, the government's not talking, was not a feeder fund. He was a lone investor.
Yes.
Who put into Madoff something like $1.5 billion, but who took out over $7 billion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why is Madoff, here's my point. Unless this money is being laundered by Picower, who used to run tax shelters, so he'd be the perfect guy to do it, or unless the money is going to either the American, Sicilian, Italian, or Russian or Israeli mafia, or unless it's going to the CIA, the Mossad, or MI6 in Britain, why is he giving Jeffrey Picower $7+ billion when he only put in 1.5?
Boy, I would love to know the answer to that. This is what the Madoff trustee was going to question Jeffrey Picower about.
And anybody surprised that he ended up at the bottom of the pool?
I have to tell you, it gave me chills when I heard the news. Picard is still going after Jeffrey Picower and a bunch of other, large investors who became billionaires as a result of being in Madoff. Many of them, I believe, avoided taxes through Madoff because, in addition to creating phony gains for his special clients, he was also creating phony losses. So, for instance, if I were a big developer and I had a big capital gain one year, I could call up my buddy Bernie Madoff and get an offsetting loss.
Right.
So Jeffrey Picower died under a very mysterious, and of course he was physically apparently quite frail, but very, striking circumstances, and we'll never know.
Yeah. Do you think, if you have any way of knowing, which you may or may not, do you think there was any involvement behind the scenes of either some Secret Service or some mafia?
I've heard rumors of this. When I was researching the book, a few people told me that some of Madoff's early investors were actually garment industry moguls, people who didn't want to use conventional banks and wanted a way to launder money. Then I heard it was the Florida mob, the Jewish mafia. Then I heard, it was all rumors. None of it was substantiated.
Right.
Harry Markopolos has his own book coming out, and he testified in front of Congress that he believes other agencies, maybe government agencies or overseas banks or maybe drug cartels were involved. I couldn't find any proof of that. If he has it, boy, I cannot wait to read the book.
Do you think, to switch back to something we were discussing a while ago, the press in general, not you. Well, I can't say not you. I can't say not you. I don't know. I presume not you. The press in general seems to take the position that people who invested in Madoff, who were not the moguls, not the
ordinary folks.
Ordinary folks, of whom I would be one. And I have to say that the point becomes even more true because although I am one of them, I am probably more sophisticated than many of the others. And I think you've got to judge by the others rather than by me. And I was fooled completely, as were the Jim Simons of the world and some of the others. But don't people like us depend on the SEC and the Wall Street crowd, foolishly, but don't we in effect depend on them to keep the crooks honest, to keep the crooks from doing crookedness?
Yes. Here's what I find so distressing. The same SEC who failed to catch Madoff, the same agency is now regulating non-Madoff investors. They're regulating mutual funds. They're regulating, and this is obviously an agency that has a brand new head, Mary Shapiro, Rob Kajami, who came out of Deutsche Bank, and they're trying very hard to put in place suggestions, like a whistleblower program or things that other agencies have, like the IRS. The IRS is famous for catching up with those of us who owe them money. And, Harry Markopolos, who has started, I believe he has a practice whereby he's a certified fraud examiner and will sue frauds on behalf of the U.S. government. In other words, if someone's defrauding the U.S. government of money, he goes after them for a fee.
Right.
None of those are in place yet. And can we blame the SEC? Yeah, of course.
This gets back to what I was saying before, why there's a potential tort case here of the first order against people who in past years, for 50, 100 years, would never have been liable to third parties. Like a feeder fund, it's liable to its investors, never to a third party for lack of diligence. I think that's going to come into question, because when you're dealing with the experts, and the experts are in one way or another on the take or fearful. You pointed out that they were scared to death they would lose their jobs, and don't at least tell the government what's going on. The rest of us are, as they say in the politest of company, SOL. We just invest with no possibility. Well, we invest at our peril. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that's coming out of this for all investors in the United States.
I totally agree. I think the other thing that investors, the rest of the non-Madoff investor world might want to know is that the insurance agency behind our accounts is this group called SIPC. And this is the agency that, at the bottom of your statement it says your account is insured by, SIPC, the Securities Investor Protection Corporation. SIPC is broke. And the only reason that we now know that is because of the Madoff fraud. That has been revealed because SIPC doesn't have the money to pay people like, yourself and other investors, or at least they claim not to have the money. And so the rest of us who, own mutual funds, plain old vanilla investments, might want to know, might want to call up your broker and find out, if something were to go wrong with my account, would SIPC be behind my investment?
Yeah. We have to take a break. I want to come back to SIPC because you're raising a very essential point, which also involves the question of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation by way of either contrast or comparison or both. It's a most important point for the American economy, but we'll discuss that right after the break. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Erin Arvedlund. Those of you who watch Books of Our Time know that many of our programs are about books that deal with history. This reflects not just my own interest in history, but also the widespread belief that we would do better if our people and leaders knew more about history. This belief is one of the important reasons why the Massachusetts School of Law is starting a new and unique college called the American College of History and Legal Studies, ACHLS. ACHLS will be a senior college offering the junior and senior years of undergraduate education. It will focus entirely on American history, including the history of some important fields of American law. It will offer specific pathways to law school for those who choose to become lawyers, including entrance into law school after the junior year for those who do well at ACHLS, and education which rigorously prepares those who choose other fields than law. Its teaching will be entirely by the discussion method, in which all students participate, as at MSL itself and other fine law schools. It will have very small classes of only 15 to 20 students. Its tuition will be only $10,000 per year, much lower than almost any other college offering a bachelor's degree. You can view ACHLS's catalog online at the web address on your screen. ACHLS will be opening in Salem, New Hampshire, which is on the New Hampshire-Massachusetts border, in August of 2010. If you would like further information about ACHLS or would like an application, call, write, or email Maureen Mooney at the phone number or addresses shown on your screen. Welcome back. Erin, the Securities Investor Protection Act, which created the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, SIPC, was designed to build confidence on the part of investors in the American securities market, because securities investment is regarded as a staple of the market. And SIPC was supposed to do one thing and another in order to ensure that it was a reasonably sized investment insurance type fund.
Right.
This is the same function, is it not, as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation plays with regard to banks?
It's the same.
Yeah. And recently, in fact, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation has told the banks they got to pony up $40 billion because they are because FDIC is paying out so much money to broke banks. SIPC, by way of contrast, has for 40 years, why has the media paid so little attention to this, other than an article in 2000 or 2001 by Gretchen Morgenson of the Times? SIPC has instead made it its business well, it's like a regular insurance company. It won't pay for anything if it can avoid it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Imagine, let's see. So first of all, SIPC charges, I think charged until recently, charged its member firms on Wall Street $150 per year.
Yeah, right.
And that's not $150 for each of our accounts. That's $150.
To Goldman Sachs.
To Goldman Sachs.
Who's giving out $20 billion in bonuses now.
Now, SIPC, I think, has applied to raise those fees, double them. I think perhaps, I think it's up to $250 or possibly more, $250. SIPC is basically a captive to the Wall Street firms that are its members. It's exactly like an insurance company to which you and I have to put in claims, which they will fight based on whether or not they want to pay out.
The current SIPC trustee in the Madoff case, who has been their go-to guy for at least 10 to 15, if not 20 to 25 years, as was disclosed in a major article in the New York Times in 2000 or 2001. As far back as that, he was their go-to guy. In 1991, he made an argument on SIPC's behalf that was so meritless that a federal judge said in print, if it went after the fact that the trustee presses this argument so vigorously, I would not discuss it, but would instead just dismiss it as frivolous. And that kind of argument, that kind of statement about SIPC's arguments are all over the place in the legal profession. The press has never been interested for some reason.
I think what's going on now is this is a question of what's called net equity, right?
Currently, yes.
Up until the Madoff case, I believe there have been very few frauds of this size in Wall Street's history.
Never been one like this size.
What's going on is the Madoff trustee, on behalf of SIPC, is trying to argue that Madoff investors should not be compensated based on what their last statement was, but on what their early investment was. Which
cash in, cash out.
Cash
you
in,
took
cash
out more than you put in, you're behind the 8 ball.
That's right. And for those people who took out more money than they put in, they may be subject to clawback. So for instance, if I not only lost the money in Madoff, but I took out more over the years, I might actually have to give money back.
And there are people who did that. They've been there in their 20, 30 years. They were using it to pay taxes. They were using it to live. They were using it like you might use a bank account if you had a bank account of $3 or $4 million.
Right. Now, some Madoff investors are pointing out that SIPC has never before used this definition of net equity.
Right.
And that the investors allege that they're doing so because they don't want to have to pay out on the insurance that they promised. And part of the SIPC's argument is that, well, you were never really invested in anything because the whole thing was a fraud. To which Madoff investors say, yeah, but I was getting statements every month from a brokerage firm that looked legitimate and I thought I was invested. So if I'm playing with chips in the casino and it all looks real, I figure I'm going to get paid if I win.
Well, you can just imagine what the reaction would be in this country if the FDIC were to say when a bank goes under, yes, you've been getting bank statements for 30 years, and the bank statements show that you have a positive sum in the bank of $150,000, but the bank was a fraud for the last 15 years. You've got nothing there, therefore we will give you nothing now that the bank has gone under. There'd probably be a revolution in this country. And the only reason the same thing, I think, is not being thought, the same revolutionary fervor, if I may put it that way, is not being expressed with regard to SIPC because so few people know about SIPC and what it does. And they figure all investors are rich anyway, which is not true. A lot of these people who lost money are firemen and policemen and workers in pension plans.
Right. So here's one of the myths of the Madoff fraud, I think. What a lot of people don't know is there were many middle class and not wealthy investors in Madoff. Many of them had no idea even that he was the portfolio manager. They were one step removed, or they came in through a bank or a feeder fund, or, for instance, like in the case of, the West Palm Beach Police Department, their pension fund had put some money into a feeder that ultimately went into Madoff. So they were several steps removed. And, I think what's important to realize is also is that hedge funds are here to stay. They are going to be with us. They're going to be in our pension funds. They're going to be probably one day in our retirement accounts, or there'll be an option in our retirement accounts. They may very well be regulated soon, potentially by the SEC. So it's going to be even more important to be vigilant and to ask the right questions about your investment.
Right.
There are other myths, too, I think, about the Madoff case. Most of the dollars invested, for instance, or much of it came from charities.
Right.
It was not just a Jewish problem. Most of the money came from endowments, foundations, and there were small investors, many of whom had, say, started with $100,000. So I think it was a warning sign for the rest of us, which exposed a lot of the issues.
That's really interesting. It was the canary in the coal mine. As we're uncovering so much fraud now and so much potential for fraud. And it's really both bigoted and wrong to dismiss it and say, well, it was just a Jewish problem, a bunch of rich Jews in New York City and Florida and Los Angeles. It's an awful lot of people who are not Jewish and who are not rich. And all of their money is at risk now because SIPC, we're finding out SIPC doesn't have the money to cover it, doesn't want to cover it, has spent decades fighting having to cover it. And the hedge funds are thus far unregulated. And Lord, all I can say is FDIC. If this were the FDIC, the country would be going under. Let's go back to something that will take us into the SEC problem again. A point that the SEC Inspector General mentioned in his report, but did not dwell upon with regard to motive, is that in 1992, the SEC investigated Madoff for the first time as a byproduct of investing two people, Bienes and Avellino, whom you have spoken about previously. And when Bienes and Avellino were required to shut their business, the SEC made this most incredible statement in the Wall Street Journal, a statement which securities lawyers, of which I once was for a couple of years, tell me is never made. In the Wall Street Journal, the Securities and Exchange Commission official said, right now there is no fraud, which led lots of people to continue their investment with Madoff instead of through Bienes and Avellino. Led other people, myself included, to invest for the first time, led people for years afterwards to continue putting money. Why do you think, do you have any notion why the SEC made this most unusual statement in the Wall Street Journal?
The only thing I can think of is that they were so relieved that the money was there, or at least most of it was there, that they decided to let the guys, well, essentially, this is the beginning of Madoff's lying career, because he told the SEC, well, I had no idea that these two guys who were raising money for me were doing it illegally. And they believed him. So to me, that was the SEC's, it was their first letdown.
Because Madoff at the time was such an admired figure at the SEC. And when Bernie Madoff said, hey, here's the money, end of story. They just didn't care to ask. Probably the money came from the Ponzi scheme that he said, here, we'll pay back. And then he called people. I know I have read people who said he actually called their family and said, if you want to leave the money directly with me, fine, I'll take it.
That's right. And I've also read interviews with others who said, one month I was getting a statement from my accountant, and then the next month I got it from Bernie Madoff.
Yeah, right.
So.
You have one other thing. In 2004, the Internal Revenue Service, which, as you pointed out, has made billions from Madoff, it made more than Jeffrey Picower, and that's a lot of money.
That's right.
And we're estimating here somewhere between 15 and 50 billion. We don't know. The government's being secretive. We have no idea. In 2004, Madoff applied to be what is called a non-bank custodian of IRAs. There's a whole statute on this.
Yep. And
the IRS approved him as a non-bank custodian of IRAs. Now, the IRS, I've written to them a couple of times, and to my amazement, they wrote back. And they made clear that all that you have to do to become a non-bank custodian of IRAs is fill out the forms. And if you fill out the forms, they, any idea, and by the way, the Congress gave them $70 million plus in 1971 or 2 or 3 to set up this organization for this segment of the 70 million. That's like maybe 250 million today. And all they do is they require you to file some forms. So this helped Bernie Madoff too. But you say that in 1992, that's when he began using the computer.
He began using this cover story, the split story conversion cover story.
And isn't that when he began, or is that when he began spitting out statements via this now very old-fashioned computer on the 17th floor?
I actually think he was sending out very sort of vague statements, almost probably way back when until the 70s. I mean, not a lot of investors kept records going back that far. However, I think in the early 90s is when Madoff needed more cash. He came up with this much more sophisticated sounding strategy. It was one that was sounded very liquid and very enticing to big institutions like these fund of funds and the feeder funds that we've heard about. So they started putting in billions of dollars. And I think it was a way for him to perpetuate the fraud, but it also made it so much bigger. By the time Harry Markopolos started sniffing around in 1999, I think he estimated that Madoff was between 5 and 7 billion.
Yeah.
And by 2008, it was going on. We're not sure what it was, but probably going on 20.
Yeah.
So.
One of the things that surprised me about the things that Harry Markopolos said, particularly in his testimony to Congress, was that he only knew about the feeder funds. He was unaware of the small individuals who had been investing with Madoff, just like the small individuals, myself for one, were completely unaware of the feeder funds.
Yeah, I think Madoff, that was by design.
Yeah.
I think Madoff wanted different investor groups to be operating independently.
Yeah.
Because it helped him keep money coming in.
Yeah. Yeah.
He also was able to, perpetuated that velvet rope trick where he made everyone feel special.
Yeah, right.
In fact, Markopolos testified in front of Congress, and it's in his testimony. He said he went on a trip to Europe, met with a dozen or half, 24 banks, and each of them separately told him, well, we're in Madoff, we get special access.
Yeah. I must say that I never felt special. I know a lot of people are said to have felt special. I mean, even small people. I just thought, well, I'm lucky. I have a friend who's been in there for a long time, so he took me, so I'm lucky, But then I don't think of things the way other people do, like special, or I'm some kind of fancy character, A lot of people do think that way. You can't get around. What was the role of his lawyer, if any, named Iris Sorkin in all of this? And how does one explain the fact, if it needs explanation, that Sorkin's family pulled their money out about a year before the collapse, after it had been in Madoff for years, as I gather? I'm not sure I'm right, but I gather that. Yeah,
there were a number of investors who pulled their money out ahead of everyone, and rather a short period prior to Madoff's confession. So among them were, I believe it was actually Ira Sorkin's, either his mother or it was an account, an inherited account. J.P. Morgan Chase pulled their money out on behalf of their clients a few months before Madoff confessed. And, you know, we can get into why.
Well,
if you like.
I wish you would. That's important.
So J.P. Morgan Chase withdrew money from Madoff. It was probably not even 3 months prior to his confession. Might have been in September, and he confessed in December. So J.P. Morgan had an unusual window into Madoff, and the reason was this. First of all, Madoff had a Chase bank account.
Right.
That was his, cash in, cash out account.
Right. So the
Everybody's
703 account.
Yeah, everybody's money in the phony hedge fund went into the same bank account. And over the years, the account grew into the billions.
Right.
So Bernie Madoff was one of Chase's best clients.
Right. They
Yeah.
made hundreds of millions off of him.
He had an enormous balance, which he maintained. Now, round about early 2008, Bear Stearns collapsed. And Bear Stearns had a very long trading relationship with Madoff on the brokerage side. They did a lot of business together. Bear Stearns collapses. J.P. Morgan took them over. And in the meantime, they had also bought Chase Bank years earlier. So now J.P. Morgan had two windows into Madoff. They had bought Chase, so they had custody over his bank account. And in the meantime, they bought Bear Stearns, which had a long trading relationship. And in 2008, as you know, the stock market started to collapse.
Right.
The S&P was down about 45%. Meanwhile, Madoff's bank account was starting to close in on zero.
Right.
And J.P. Morgan started to get worried. They started asking their coworkers at Bear Stearns, you've got a long relationship with Madoff. How does he do it with his hedge fund? How does he make 10% a year? Well, we have no idea. Basically, the allegation is, and I think this will be borne out in court, or at least it will be answered in court, is that J.P. Morgan couldn't, either they had early warnings based on the fact that they had a window into Madoff's bank account, and they had a relationship with an old friend on Wall Street, which was Bear Stearns. They had worries and questions that they couldn't answer, and they pulled their money out.
Right, because they had this deal that they invested in, where they were de facto, they and their customers were investing in Madoff, and that's what they pulled all that money out, right?
That's right.
So they saved their money, they saved their customers' money. They didn't tell the SEC anything?
Well, actually, some of their investors are suing J.P. Morgan Chase because
Right.
The bank pulled its own money out, but
Right.
not all of its clients' money.
And one of the accusations is that over the years, because of what the money flowing back and forth to Madoff's London office, we haven't gotten into that, but in essence, the London office was the same kind of slush fund that the 703 account was. Mm-hmm. And to fool people, sometimes he would send money to London and have London send it back, and money to London, London send it back. And he would tell people, well, I'm doing business with people abroad, and that's how
Right.
I do this and that, the options and so on. And the allegation is that this is typical of money laundering, and when more than $10,000 is involved, a bank, a J.P. Morgan Chase, no less than anybody else, has a responsibility, has a legal duty to inform the government that something looks fishy here. Mm-hmm. And they never did.
He had a legitimate brokerage firm and the phony hedge fund. He had to figure out a way to make it look like he was actually trading on behalf of the fund, whereby he would go to the J.P. Morgan Chase account and basically wire money to London, where he had an office, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars, and then just wire it back.
Right.
That's money laundering in our country.
Right.
And that was one of the counts on which Madoff was charged, aside from securities fraud. Now, hedge funds, are a very easy place to launder money. As I said, they're not yet regulated by Congress, or they're not overseen by the SEC in large part. And it's still possible to do it.
Right. Right.
So, we don't know who the investors are many times. We don't know the source of the money, or it can come in through a corporate entity. So it's still very possible.
I think J.P. Morgan's got years of massive lawsuits ahead of it because it's got the money to pay every investor, I think. And there's no doubt that what J.P. Morgan did, well, based on what I've read in the complaints, it would seem that J.P. Morgan has some things to answer for. And you're the one, I think, from where I read it, in the last year, something like 12 or 15 billion, I forgot the exact total, got pulled out of the 703 account by people who were redeeming. If J.P. Morgan had blown the whistle, there would be at least another 3 to 6, maybe $12 billion left for the investors who were defrauded.
Well, that's what the lawsuit alleges, is that they were tipped off early.
Right. And Frank Avellino told his housekeeper a few days before, your money's lost. Hey, how did he know? You talk, and not too many people have, about the repeal of Glass-Steagall as setting the stage and making possible this massive fraud. And this repeal of Glass-Steagall, which essentially started in the 1980s by rulings of the controller of the currency, I think it was, in the Federal Reserve Board. In 1999, Greenspan and Robert Rubin and Larry Summers and all the people who are still running our economy made sure that there was repeal of Glass-Steagall. Explain briefly in about 2.5 minutes what Glass-Steagall was, why it came about, and how its repeal set the stage for all of this.
Glass-Steagall was once the law of the land, which separated commercial banks or depositor banks from investment banks.
Right.
And so with the rise of big financial groups like Citibank, which wanted to be in both businesses, the law was repealed.
Now, the depository bank is what we put our money in, we take checks out.
A savings depository.
And Goldman Sachs, that was an investment bank.
So then it became possible in the 1990s for these financial supermarkets to offer everything: investment banking, mutual funds, deposits. And as a result, however, it became possible for these big banks to take risks that had never before been taken with depositors' money.
That's crucial.
And including getting into hedge funds.
Right.
AIG, for instance, was able to gamble with policyholders' money on these credit default swaps.
Right.
And the firm almost went under, but for a government bailout. And there were a bunch of other examples. Now, I'm not an expert on Glass-Steagall, and those people are out there. So all I guess, for Madoff investors' sake, what's interesting is that Glass-Steagall is not coming back. And if you go to a bank, or you go to your mutual fund, or you go to an investment bank, it's very hard to tell the difference between them. Which is why it's so important, like I said, to find out who has custody of your assets. Is there an independent party in between your money, and your money manager? Because there should be.
People have said that banking, commercial banking, taking deposits, giving you a checking account.
It's not profitable.
It's supposed to be a boring business. It is supposed to be a boring business. When these commercial bankers were permitted to start buying all this stuff with tranches and securitized mortgages and the default swaps, that set the stage for disaster, and that's what Glass-Steagall did, and it was done by the geniuses who are running our economy now. This is a terrible situation. That's my personal opinion, folks, not my employers. Well, Erin, I do believe that this is likely to become a lot of people's Bible about what happened in the Bernie Madoff case. And there's a lot more that we can and will talk about after you do, maybe even before you do the sequel to your book, because I've got some other things planned about this. And I want to thank you for coming from Philadelphia and enlightening us. You've done a lot of work for many years, well, many years ago, and then again in the last year and a half. And it's great that you shared so much of that with our audience.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. To the audience, thank you very much, and be with us again next time.